safe space. We ain't never give a reason you should hide. Compile all your questions, we taking the quest. Join Tarcia on this journey to discover the rest. Go.
Welcome to the Adoption Journey podcast. I am your host, Tarcia Smith, and welcome back to another week for another story, yet another journey. Before we get started, you all know to go like, subscribe, tell all your friends, share, do all the things. So I won't spend any more time there. Without further ado, this face right here is no stranger to the adoption community. And I want to welcome Mr. Tony Hynes. Hi, Tony.
Hi, Tarcia. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Full transparency, I have to tell the people what I did. I got a chance to talk to Tony before. It is the very day, only a couple hours after I had learned that I had lost my birth father. And I decided to still do the interview. And then after the interview, I was like, why did you do that interview? So we're back for take 2 with Tony. So I want to start because like I just told Tony, our last conversation is a whole blur. So this is like brand new information for me. So tell me, how old were you when you found out that you were adopted?
I was 5 when I found out that I was adopted. I was in a home at the time that was my foster home, and it became my adoptive home. And my foster parents at the time sat me down and asked, would you like to be a member of this family in a permanent way? And would you like to have your name changed? And I remember saying, well, I'm already a member of this family, right? So it makes sense. And so that's when the adoption happened, was when I was 5.
So the name change, first and last, or just last?
First and last. And it's funny because my name on the screen here that I'm seeing is Tony Hynes. Right. So my first name is Tony, but my government name is Anthony Hynes. And my birth mom actually gave me the name Tony. So most Tonys go by Tony, but are really Anthony is our name. But my birth mom didn't do that. Tony was the name that she gave me without any Anthony to it. And my parents, my adoptive parents, wanted to change that to make Anthony that formal name and to make Tony my nickname. And so Tony became my nickname and Anthony became my government name. And then my last name, Hynes, was the name they ended up using for me as far as my last name was considered. And that was changed as well. But as you see, I go by Tony. Everybody calls me Tony.
Yeah. And
that's a connection that I have to my birth mom. And I don't actually feel comfortable when people call me Anthony. It seems foreign to me. I always take a split second longer to respond if someone calls me by that name. And it's usually someone who I don't know, a college professor or MBA or someone at the dentist office, wherever, that may call me by Anthony. And it always takes me that split second longer to react.
So that's got to be confusing, though, at 5, because I'm a whole big age. And that's confusing for me. Anthony, Tony, Anthony. Why change it? And I know you may not have the answer to that question, but they could have just left you at Tony.
No, I agree. And I think that the thinking at the time was, well, Anthony is the normal name that Tony has, that Tonys, plural form, obviously go by. And it's more formal to be used in formal settings, right? And I think that when I do trainings, though, for adoptive parents, I did an ethics training last week on ethical clinical practices in adoption. One of the things that I named was not changing the names of children who are adopted, and that being unethical to change the names of kids who are adopted, because it is confusing. And apart from that, it's also something that is further separating them from an identity, their birth families, especially when you have international adoptees. Their names are frequently changed, and so it's separating them nationally, culturally, family-wise from their birth families too. So I do feel now that it would have been better just to leave my name as Tony and it's the name that I go by
It's, you
today.
go by it anyway.
Anyway,
So,
yeah,
right. So, I want you to back up for me a little bit. How did you end up in foster care, or why is a better question?
that's a great question. So I ended up in foster care for several different reasons, but the primary reason in my case being that my birth mother happens to be schizophrenic. So she wasn't able to care for me in the way that she wanted to. And so for the first year or so of my life, she was trying, she was doing the dance of raising me, but then also having a relative also raised me, and that relative was my grandmother. So I
Mm-hmm.
was kind of in my grandmother's home for a lot of the time, and then with my mother for some of that time. And I was also going into an orphanage kind of on and off the first year and a half of my life. And I was told that I was basically, for lack of a better term, dropped off at the orphanage when my mom was having particular challenges raising me. And one of those times, she was told that either you leave Tony here or you take him home indefinitely, but you can't keep doing this back and forth with the orphanage. So you need to leave him in the orphanage or you need to take him home with you. And it was at that point in time that she decided that, okay, I'm going to have Tony remain in the orphanage. I think with the thought in mind that when I'm ready, I'll come back for him. Grandmother will raise him. But I was there for 2 years or so. And then that's when I was matched with my foster parents at the time, who ended up becoming my adoptive parents.
So, here's what's interesting about that. You hear a lot of talking within the adoption community that say adoption shouldn't exist because their family members should be able to step in. And you have a case where there was a grandmother, but you didn't end up with the grandmother. You still ended up in foster care and ultimately adopted. What do you say to those people that say adoption shouldn't even exist? The resources should only exist.
I said that their thoughts are valid, right? Because we have history to tell us that a lot of adoptive placements are ones with trauma, ones with abuse. So often, when it comes to adoption, people talk about the trauma that people experienced prior to being adopted, but they don't talk about the trauma that children experience after being adopted as much. When we look at data, we don't see that adoptive households have less abuse within them than non adoptive households. Some studies actually show that there's more abuse in adoptive households. So there isn't actually, and this is where the narratives and the bias in narratives come into play. We are frequently told that adoptees have, quote, better lives.
Mm-hmm.
And these better lives are lives that are only better when quantified in ways that have to do a lot of times with economics and where those adoptees are living. But when you take that away and
Mm-hmm.
you actually look at well being and how children are feeling, we actually are not seeing that. And in my case, my grandmother actually did end up challenging my adoption. So I
Okay.
was adopted, I was 5. And then 3 months after the adoption, it was actually overturned by a panel of judges who had stated that, because in my case, I had foster parents who were white, I had foster parents.
Oh, we gonna get there. I do
Okay.
remember that. That I do remember. We gonna get there.
So I'll stop there for now to leave it. But I think that's why people are saying that when it comes to, I don't think adoption should exist. And you talked about, getting there from the racialized standpoint. There's layers to that piece too, in terms of interracial adoptive placements and people thinking that those particular types of family placements shouldn't exist. And so in my family, my grandmother was someone who was already raising my sister,
Okay.
who is 9 years older than I am. My grandmother was getting a little bit older in age at that particular point in
Sure.
time. And I don't know, I've never asked her the question how she felt about raising another child, because my sister was not the first child that she would raise in that particular family structure. And so I don't know where her mind frame was about it, but I do know that that should have been given more consideration, not only in my case, but in other cases for sure.
Okay, let's turn the corner because since you brought it up, I was going there. So your adoptive family. I don't want to ask. They are white. Tell me about your adoptive parents. Who were they?
Well, I want to first also start by kind of going where a lot of adoptees' guts go, like what the gut reaction is when we're asked that question.
Okay.
Tell me about your adoptive parents. Because the gut reaction, the gut response is often, they're great, they're awesome, right? And I think that that response is happening because of societal expectations around what we're supposed to say or what people think we're supposed to say. We're supposed to be grateful, we're supposed to be lucky, we're supposed to express appreciation. So I will not say that. What I will say is that my adoptive parents were people who were complex individuals, people who didn't know all that they should have known about adopting and adopting a Black child before adopting, people who did more work, quote, the work, than other comparable parents a lot of times with regard to my particular era of adoption when it came to race, when it came to talking about birth family. And they were also people that were on, different motivations for adopting in the first place. One of my
Oh, stop right
parents,
there.
yeah.
What's the motivation for adopting?
Well, one, and as adoptees, oftentimes, and this is people, period, but we have to go off what we're told, right? So,
Right.
what I'm told is that one of my parents wanted to have a child and wanted to adopt specifically, and that it was their idea to adopt. And another one of my parents didn't really know whether they wanted to adopt or have a child or not, but really loved my other parent and was willing to open their home to a child. And so they went along with kind of different mindsets about why they wanted to have a child in their home. And we see that in non adoptive households, but I think it's also incredibly relevant and especially relevant when you talk about adoptive households because those motivational differences happen a lot in a lot of adoptive
So the
households.
one parent that wanted to adopt, why? What was the reason for wanting to adopt?
Well, one of the reasons why she wanted to adopt is because she happened to be gay and she knew that it was that was the best way to grow her family was through adoption. She had mentioned in her journal surrogacy ideas or the other ways to create a family, but she felt like adoption was for her the way that felt most in line with who she was as an individual. She
Okay.
was a lawyer and she was a lawyer in the family court system for children and advocated for the rights of children. So she'd seen children in foster care. She'd seen children be adopted. And I think she felt connected to that particular population, and that's why she wanted to adopt. My other parent, I think that the reason why she went along with the adoption once they got further into it was because she began to see that this, if they were going to have a child, was again the only way that they were going to have a child. And my parents also had adoptive parents, a 20-year age difference. And the parent who hadn't had the idea to adopt, she was the one who was 20 years older. So I also feel like she was probably feeling, okay, I'm in my mid 40s now. I don't know if I'm going to have another chance to have a child.
Wait a minute. 20-year age difference? So somebody was in their 40s and somebody was in their 20s,
That's correct. That's correct.
and the 20 something year old is like, hey, let's adopt.
Yeah,
And the 40 something year old is like, girl, I'm in my 40s.
exactly.
Pretty much.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. And so tell me, around what year is this that your parents are adopting? Like,
This was 1995.
and in 1995 is not like 2024 when it comes to the laws that are in place and just how things are now.
Yeah.
Was it hard for them to adopt not only just adopt, but then to adopt a little black boy?
It's very hard. It's very hard for them to adopt and to adopt a little black boy. A lot of their coworkers said that, "Are you sure about this? Are you sure you want to do this?" Apparently, coworkers were talking behind their back about it. And,
Sure.
after the adoption took place, the reason why it was overturned by those panel of judges was because the judges were saying a white, gay, same sex household isn't the right household to raise a black child in. And so we also had these foundational differences and
Right.
opinions about what that adoption would mean, would look like in practice.
And when it was overturned, did you go back to your grandmother,
I
or did
didn't.
you
So,
go ahead?
no, it's a really great question. And I didn't at that time. When the adoption was overturned, I continued to remain in the custody legally of Mary and Janet, my two moms, while the appeals process took place. So they appealed that decision, and they appealed it actually all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court knocked it down to the lower courts, and the lower courts eventually decided upon a joint custody agreement, basically an open adoption, but technically not an adoption anymore, between my birth family and my adoptive family. So the joint custody agreement stipulated that I was going to go visit my birth family however many times my birth family would like. And the agreement that they came to was that I was going to go every week to see my birth family. Usually it was Sundays, and spend the day with them, and then go back and live with Mary and Janet the rest of the time. And that's how we did things until I was a teenager. And then it changed a little bit when I was a teenager as
Okay,
far as
hold
the
on.
frequency.
Walk me through that. Is that confusing for you? Is that frustrating for you as a kid? What's that like for you?
It's definitely confusing. It's frustrating. It's scary as well, because there, for me, we talk about permanency and adoption. I had grown accustomed to living with my two moms, Mary and Janet.
Hmm.
I did not have a working memory of being with my birth mom, right? And I say working memory there, right? But I had a memory of being with Mary and Janet in this household. And so, because the adoption was overturned, every time I went to my birth family's home and then came back, I would think to myself, well, is this placement really permanent for me? Is there going to be a time where
Mm.
the judges say that I have to go live with my birth family? So I would have actually nightmares every week about, and it
Mm.
was always the exact same nightmare of the middle of the night, the social worker showing up and knocking on the door and saying that Tony has to go now, and taking me out of the home, and then my mom's
Yeah.
dropping me off at my grandmother's home, and then going into her home and living there. And so I shouldn't say never, but there wasn't really clarity with regard to permanence. And I talk about this in my trainings. Every time that you go to different places as a child and spend time with different family members, there are changes in scenery, there are changes in smell.
Okay, right.
All
And that's why I chuckled a little bit, because I just had the thought of the drastic difference that you went from your black grandmother in her home and the cultural differences, and then going to live with your parents Monday through Saturday. That's a lot. And I'm sure it was super different in both homes.
oh yeah, it was night and day in a lot of ways. And I talk about that through writing. So I've written about that. And so one of the differences that you'll notice right away between those two homes would be the couches. And
Hmm.
couches being that the couch of my adoptive parents is your standard, beige, boring couch. You just sit on it. Doesn't really have character. Then when you go into my grandmother's home and you sit on that couch, it's adorned with these patterns, but the biggest difference is that your butt squeaks when you sit on the couch because it's plastic, it's
It's
wrapped.
plastic. I knew you were going to say that. Grandma was old school. She still had the plastic on the sofa. I knew you were going to say that.
Yes. So you don't know when I don't know when I'm 4, 5, 9 that this is a cultural thing, right? That this
Yeah, for
is
sure.
a cultural
It's
difference. And
an
so
old school thing. If y'all are not old enough to know about the plastic on the couch, we may not be able to be friends. You might not be old enough to be my friend.
right.
That's funny. And it's such a memory for you.
Mhm. Yeah, like I still remember sitting down and how my butt felt, and I with the sounds that the plastic would make. I remember moving and not wanting to move too much if my grandmother was doing something, and not wanting to annoy her by moving a lot on the couch. So it was definitely different in that way. And then the ways that my grandmother would speak to me versus the ways that my moms would speak to me at home were
Tell me
different.
about that.
So my grandmother was someone she was very direct, she was very blunt, and she didn't suffer fools, and she was someone who always wanted to tell it like it was from her perspective. Did I agree with her perspective a lot of times? No, but she would tell it from her perspective. So if she wanted me to do something, this isn't something I disagreed with, but she would just say, Tony, over there in my purse, get this now, etc. No, not there, here. Very direct A, B, C, D.
And because I
Whereas,
said so.
right. Whereas, and my adoptive moms, they also were kind of raised in old school homes as well.
Sure.
So some of the direction was it's similar in terms of how they would say it, but the results if I didn't do something were similar sometimes as far as the dissatisfaction. But one of the things that my grandmother really disliked was that I was adopted by a white couple and a gay white couple, and she was not shy in sharing that
I was
and sharing.
literally just getting ready to ask you, what did grandmama say? Because we're and because I know this grandmama. I know her. What did she was she vocal to you as a child about your adoptive parents? And
Always,
sure.
always,
What did
yes.
grandmama say? What was she saying when you went on Sundays?
She would say, "Do they let you have any black friends?" Is one of the things that she would say.
Mm.
She would say, "You know that they stole you from us." Is another thing that she would say. She would say, when I was 13, 14, she would say, "Do you
Hold,
have?"
stop, stop, back up. They stole you from us. Why did grandmama think that?
I think that was because of the custody case. And I think it was because she felt as though my time spent in the orphanage, as I mentioned, my birth mother having me stay there wasn't going to be permanent. That
Mm-hmm.
in this family, that we always raise the kids in this family. And outsiders generally aren't raising kids in the family, much less, white parents, much less lesbian white parents. And so when the adoption was taking place, I think my grandmother thought that it probably wasn't going to happen.
Sure.
And I also think, though, that there's a broader cultural, racialized context to it with regard to interracial adoption and Black families for generations and generations. And that continues today, having their children being unjustly taken from their home environments and placed with adoptive families, frequently with white adoptive families. And so I think they stole you from us was how she felt on an individual level, but also macro level. But I also think my case has additional complexities because I found out when I was, I think, 13 or 14 years old. And this was Christmas time. I was at my grandmother's house at Christmas time, and we were doing Secret Santa. And my cousin, who had never liked me very much, when I was receiving my Secret Santa, and I don't know why exactly, but when I was receiving my Secret Santa gift, he said, "Why is Tony getting gifts? He's not a member of the family." And I remember thinking to myself, it doesn't just seem like he's just saying that to say it. It seems like he not only means that, but it seems like that's coming from some type of legitimate place. And I came to find out that my grandmother, the person that I've been calling my grandmother my entire life, that she wasn't actually my grandmother, that she was a friend of my actual grandmother, my birth grandmother, that she was a friend of my actual grandmother. I've never met
Tony,
my actual grandmother before. And so
Tony,
you talk
Tony,
about confusing, right?
Tony. My head is spinning right now.
Yeah.
Okay. So the lady that was fighting for you and was uh, your grandmother, or so you thought,
Right. Right.
really was not biologically your grandmother.
That's
Did
correct.
I? Okay. For the listeners and myself. Okay.
That is correct. That is correct.
Um, where's your mom during this?
So my mom is also one of the plaintiffs in the appeal of the custody case.
Okay.
And so she is around. I saw my mom growing up probably once or twice a year. She would come to my grandmother's house to see me. And I remember when I was 7 years old, the custody battle actually took a few years. So the adoption happened when I was 5. They didn't come to the agreement on the custody battle until I was 7, going on 8 years old. So I remember being in my grandmother's house
The
and
lady that's not for real your grandmother.
correct. And that's why I think naming is so important because even though she is not biologically my grandmother, right? I still refer to her in that way
Sure.
for the same reasons that I referred to my adoptive parents, my moms, as my parents.
Now, could that have any bearing on why the courts did what they did because this lady was not biologically related to you?
In my case, no. And here's the
Okay.
wrinkle to it. And that's a great question. It's because the social worker, my social worker in my case, who came to my mom's household all the time, she was in and out. She was our social worker.
Mm-hmm.
She was feeding misinformation to my grandmother, and she was telling my grandmother, "You can't allow this adoption to happen." So she was basically a double agent, right? She was saying to my grandmother, "Here's what you do to try to gain custody of him. You
Mm-hmm.
need to lie to the court and tell him that you're his biological grandmother because it'll make it easier for you to gain custody of him if you do that." And so she was given that information. So that's what she went to the courts with. And the courts, to my knowledge, didn't know that she wasn't my biological grandmother because my social worker did a good job of not bringing that to the court and telling her how she could have that
Mm.
be left out of the
Okay.
information.
Okay. All right. Let's fast forward a little bit because I
Yeah.
need a Motrin, I think.
Right.
um, so this you're going back and forth, and you said it slowed down a little bit by the time you got to your teenage years. I imagine maybe high school.
Yeah.
Why did it slow down with you visiting so much? And this right around the time when you learn that that's not really your
Yeah.
grandmother.
That's true. I think, and I want to be accurate here. I don't feel that it slowed down necessarily when I was in high school. I think that it was already slowing down when I was 10, 11, 12, and
Oh,
it
okay.
continued into that. I think that part of the reason for that was I think both families felt comfortable with the arrangement, or as comfortable as they were going to feel, maybe I should say, with the
Sure.
arrangement, with the agreement. And I don't feel either my grandmother's family or my adoptive family were at a point where they felt like Tony needs to go every single week like he's been going. But I also think a lot of it had to do with me. I think that I often didn't like going, to be honest with you.
Why?
I didn't like going to my grandmother's home because and I love my grandmother, I always will, and I love my sister who was sometimes there when I was over there, but it was challenging because I was challenged almost every time I went over there by my grandmother. It
Mm.
was they stole you was not something she said one time. It was
Oh, I know. I
you know
know.
she was
She
it
was
was
saying it all every time, every
right
chance she got. She was
right exactly.
saying it. I know.
This is an ongoing thing, and same thing with racialized pieces of the discussion. And then when I was getting into my teenage years, Same thing with regard to sexual identity too, because it was a rumor in the family. Well, Tony was raised by gay people, so he's going to be gay himself. Was the thought process with my grandmother and some within that her family. And so she would ask me questions when I was 14, 15, and she would say, do you have a girlfriend yet? And I would say, no, grandma, I don't have a girlfriend yet. And she would say, you got a boyfriend yet? And so these types of things weren't things that made me feel necessarily enthused, I would say,
Sure.
to visit. And I think that, yes, I think finding out that I wasn't actually a member of her family was very hurtful, for me, and it felt, as an adoptee, it felt like a second rejection, because I felt like, okay,
Mm,
well, even though sometimes I feel uncomfortable, and even though my grandmother says this, at the end of the day, this is my birth family, and I love them. And to find out that I do still love them, but to find out that they were not blood related to me, that it's only my sister and my birth mom, was something that was very depressing for me, at that time to discover. And I think also made me feel like, to your point, well, what's the point of me going over there if they're not technically my birth family anyway? So I'm just
mm-hmm.
going over to see this family. And my sister, because she's older than me, she was already out of my grandmother's household.
Yeah,
So by the
sure.
time I was 15 years old, my sister was living in a different state. So I was actually the only person there a lot of times, unless there was an in-law there that wasn't an actual, member, birth, blood wise, of that family.
So you said something a while ago. One of the questions that you would get asked was, do they let you have black friends? Did they let you have black friends?
Right, right. And I think that I don't think that's a bad question. I don't. I think that it isn't necessarily the right question to ask a child,
No,
right? I think that
sure.
you should direct that to the parents, right, or to the social whoever. But I think when we think about, do they let, right? I think that we're not. No one is think. I think most people would assume she's not saying that if there's two houses, that she's saying the parents are automatically saying you're not allowed to go over there. But I think the assumption, though, is that, what type of community are you living in?
Right,
Who do you feel comfortable around? Who does it
right.
look like you're uncomfortable around? What type of language are you using when it comes to racialized issues? Is that discouraging Tony in any way from feeling comfortable about having black friends? So I think that's really the inclination. That's really the thought process behind statements, questions like that. And to answer your question, yes, they did let me have black friends when I was growing up. Our household, my adopted family's household, was filled with books by black authors. I watched this PBS series called Eyes on the Prize,
Mm,
back to front when I was growing up. And this series covers the 1950s, 1960s,
I know it
1970s.
well.
Well, I know you do, you know.
I
So
know.
that was
Mm,
instrumental for me in seeing the power of our blackness. And I had Negro Leagues baseball hats growing up that they bought for me. I was really big into black athletes. I was really big into Jackie Robinson and Jesse Owens and Hank Aaron. My favorite historical figure was Malcolm X before I was even 15 years old. So my moms knew that race was important for me to think about, was important for me to have pride in for myself. And for me, that meant that, why wouldn't I have a black friend then? They look like me, they understand me in ways that
mm-hmm.
other people don't understand me. Why wouldn't I have a black friend? And I haven't been told, these negative things necessarily about blackness growing up. So I don't feel that I had internalized racism as myself as a 12, 15-year old. Now, does that mean
Sure.
that my adoptive moms did everything the right way when it came to race, or that they were free of microaggressions themselves? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But I think that's why I did feel comfortable having black friends when I was growing up.
I want to ask you about your hair growing up.
The
Go
hair,
ahead.
hair
Did
is,
they know what to do with your hair?
and I want to pause there also because I feel like that's a really great question, and it's a part of a larger discussion, right? Because they had these books, they had these movies, they had Motown was played in our household growing up,
Hmm.
but that doesn't mean that culturally they understood all of the important things that go along with what it means to be Tony. And what it means to be Tony also goes along with what I want my hair to look like, what we want our hair to be and feel in our identities, and how it moves through us. And my adoptive parents, had my hair very short, which is very common for white adoptive parents, particularly black boys. My haircut was always a one, so it was always very low. It was always
Ball
basically
fade.
oh yeah. So a lot of people listening probably know what a one is. If you don't, just think of Kobe Bryant's hair. He had the afro, and when he cut his hair after he had the afro, and what his hair looked like then. That's a one. That's primarily what I had.
Wait, hold on. I have to ask this question.
Yeah,
How did you learn the numbers? Were they taking you to the barbershop or were you going to sports clips like our friend Isaac?
friend Isaac. Yeah, you know what?
Hey, Isaac.
Yeah, I know, right? So I did know the numbers, and so there's levels to this, right? Because my mom's took me to a barbershop called Ebony Barbers was the name of the barbershop. And so everyone in the barbershop was black, besides my mom, who would be in there. And as I got older, she would just
Drop you
drop me off
Sure.
exactly, right? And so I knew what a one was, what a two was, and I knew then when I was growing up that my mom's usually had me get the one, and the idea being, of course, in this racialized, these racist aggression manners, that it's easier to manage the hair if it's just shorter, right? It's
Mm.
easier. It shouldn't get too long. Let's just keep it short. Let's try to not manage it. And a microaggression that my adoptive mom, one of them had when I got older, when I was 17, 18, when I was growing my hair out a little bit more, even when I was 20, 21, was your hair's a little long, Tony. You sure you don't want to? Nope.
Nope,
Nope.
you better leave me alone for I have a big afro. Keep
Right.
talking.
It'll get longer, not shorter. No. So that hair is such a huge marker of identity, and it's such a
Sure.
huge piece of importance within the black community. And it's something that parents that are not black, and particularly white adoptive parents, don't understand the importance of. I think that there are a lot of hair care workshops that are being done these days, which is great. But I think part of that discussion is, and some of these parents do this too, where they know how to do their kids' hair. White parents are saying, well, I braid my child's hair. They might be listening to this and say, oh, well, I have that one down. Okay, fine, you have the hair down, but there are other pieces of this that are really important. Do you talk about racism? Do you talk about systemic racism and how it impacts communities of color,
Mm.
black communities if you have a black child? You know how to do hair, but do you know about other important pieces of these cultural texts that go along with the way that we shake hands often, right? Do you know what a dap is and what that looks like? Or is your kid going to struggle with that when a child in their class does that to them the first time? So there are these other ways that parents really need to be assessing things and doing things. And for adoptees out there listening, it's also knowing that just because you don't know how to you don't know how to braid your own hair, braid someone else's hair, or just because you don't know this music or that music doesn't mean that you're less of this. It's
Mm.
a result of all of the experiences you have had. And it means that there's opportunities for you to learn if you want to. And it doesn't negate how black you are either.
That's a word right there. um, I want to jump over a lane because you also said something a little bit ago about well, Tony's being raised in a gay household, so that means he's going to be gay. How do you navigate that? What do you
Well,
say to that?
right. All I could say when my grandmother was saying, do you have a girlfriend or do you have a boyfriend back then, was to say, no, grandma, I don't. And I didn't say I'm straight or I'm heterosexual because I just felt like that was giving validation, I think, to her question, her statements in the first place. The way that I dealt with it when I was 14 was different than the way that I dealt with it when I was 19. So I
Because
remember
hold on, wait, I want to ask you another question. I still want you to answer that question, but when you are growing up and people know what your parents are, now we're talking about in the 90s is a different time. Are people saying that to you?
no one said that to me before, but I think that for me, the racial piece, when it came to what people might have felt like my identity was more aligned with the racial part of that discussion, meaning that people felt like, are you going to be more comfortable with white people? I've had,
Okay.
are you going to be more comfortable dating white women? Are you going to be Republican? Are these,
Okay.
obviously there are Republicans of all colors
Of
here, but
all colors.
but when it comes to demographics, we know that wider swath obviously are white individuals when it comes to demographics, and
Sure.
that goes along. Political affiliation also goes along with the ways we're sometimes coding racial politics and what they mean for us. And so I think that those were conversations that people had with me and asked me.
Okay.
When it came that being raised by two lesbian women, questions were more, what is that like? And how does that feel? Or how do you feel about two women raising children? Right? How
Great.
do you feel
Answer
about
all those questions.
right? The questions that I think people want to know, right? I think so. The answer, I'll start with the last one. How do you feel about gay people raising children? I feel the same way about gay people raising children that I do about heterosexual people raising children, that they should, and they do a great job, they do a poor job, but they should be allowed the right to do all of those jobs in the same ways that other folks are allowed to. And logically, to me, it's never made sense that gay people have been denied the right to adopt or denied the right to marry. It's based upon how people feel. Sometimes, yes, from a faith-based perspective, but oftentimes, in my experience, from a
Hmm.
bias, from a prejudice-based perspective, that is often um, you, they're often using their faith to justify their prejudice that they're already bringing to the table, the bias that they're already bringing to the table. So I feel that gay people should be allowed to raise children, and I also feel though that just because a family is gay and adopting doesn't mean that they're going to be more prepared to be adoptive parents than anyone else. Because sometimes what I see in the LGBTQ plus community are narratives that LGBTQ plus folks are more equipped to raise children because we face discrimination, we face marginalization, so we are more equipped to raise a child of color if we're white than other parents. And I'm here to tell you, LGBT,
Hmm.
LGBTQ plus white adoptive parents just as racist as any other adoptive parents out there, right? Have just as many faults, just as many this, just as many that, just as many joys, just as many great qualities as other families do.
Hmm.
And so I think that each family is unique, but I think that all of those families should not only be allowed the right to adopt, but we should accept and support those families and make sure that those families aren't discriminated against and aren't castigated for these different reasons. So that's how I answer that first one. How did it feel for me having two moms growing up? That's always a difficult question for me to answer because I think to myself, answering it is almost like answering what would it be like to exist in an alternate reality. I only know the reality that I existed in.
Oh,
So in order to answer the question, I have to do that comparison, but I don't have something to compare it to for my own experience. So what I
yeah.
say to people is just that Well, it was a lot of things. It was a lot of different things, right? And I think that when it came to being raised by two women, there were things that were challenges, and there are things that are advantages that I had being raised by two women. One of the advantages is that I feel comfortable opening up to women, and I always have, because my moms were people that, particularly my mother Mary, was open to talking about how she felt and her feelings, was very open to talking with me about how she was feeling about lots of different things. And so I'm very comfortable talking about how I'm feeling emotionally. I'm comfortable talking to women about how I'm feeling emotionally in ways, in a gendered way, that a lot of men struggle with. Not saying that I can't do a better job. I can always do a better job, but I think that that was an advantage for me. I think that a challenge was not having a male in the household.
I was just going to ask you that.
It was a challenge not having a male in the household. And I tell families that are two dads or two moms, I say, it's great that you are doing what you're doing. And also know that it's important to have, different genders as representations for your child, whether your
Did
child is however they identify.
did you have that, a male role model? Did they
I, had,
provide that for you, or did you kind of find that on your own?
I think both in my case. And I think that I had several male role models. One was a gentleman who lived across the street from us, and he was this very masculine presenting guy. Like, he's over 6 feet tall, big guy, really into driving in his motorcycles, as a very baritone voice, is very gruff but welcoming at the same time,
Hmm.
and a black male. And he always took me under his wing if I went over there and needed any type of advice, or if I was arguing with my mom's. Sometimes I would go over to his house and hang out with him. And so he's definitely a role model that I still look up to this day, and had when I was growing up. And I
Hmm.
did have other male role models. The parent of my best friends when I was growing up,
Okay.
very positive male role model. But I think when it came to what did I do for, how did I find them? I found them in peer relationships too, though, because my peer relationships were very helpful from that gender perspective when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. Because to your point, I didn't know what to do with my hair. I didn't know what lotions to use on my skin. I didn't know how to dab. I didn't know that.
Tony, you was around here ashy.
Yeah, I was. Wintertime, Lubriderm is not good for my skin, Tarsha. That is not what I need. Like,
Give this man some cocoa butter and
yes,
some
please,
shea butter.
please. Why is I keep putting so much Lubriderm on? It doesn't. It just washes right off. What's going on? And they said, "You can't use that. That doesn't work for us."
It's comical, but it's things, little things like this that culturally, you just if you don't know, you just don't know.
Exactly. And like that's why those peer relationships were so important for me to have, because there's some things, yes, that Kevin, that person across the street, could help me with, but there were other things that my peers and my male peers were definitely helpful for me in. And even seeing how they were interacting with girls at the time our own age was helpful to me, because I didn't have
Mm.
talks about, oh, this is how you do this is how you do that, from a male perspective. So those things were very
Huh.
informative for me
Yeah.
in those formative years.
Yeah. Oh, I never even, that's a piece I didn't think about. How to date. How,
Yeah, and I had to learn that stuff. I had to use it as a muscle, right? Like everybody does, but it was definitely separate. And one other thing about the having two moms piece is I would learn when I was a little bit older and into dating, was that I was also going to have to respond to how a date was feeling about gay people, right? Because if there was someone who said that I'm uncomfortable with gay people, or I don't think gay people should be allowed to marry, or something like that, I'd have to be
mm-hmm.
like, oh, well, it's probably not going to be the best person for me, right? And so finding my partner now, like my wife, that's why it's so, that piece was very important, in our relationship.
So, did you find yourself? I love to ask transracial adoptees this. Did you lean more to white girls or black girls, or did it matter?
I always lean more to black girls, honestly, and
Hmm, that's
I
different
yeah,
because normally the answer I get is whatever they were being raised by,
mhm.
that's what they lean towards.
I just I found black women to be powerful,
Oh,
beautiful.
because we're all that.
Oh yeah,
But
exactly. So I
and
mean
we are.
exactly. So why don't you find other? Oh yeah, sure for other, but in particular for me,
Yeah,
that's how
yeah.
I felt and feel, and so that's always. And I do think that maybe because I had an open adoption in a sense, maybe
Okay.
that was helpful for me because I saw strong black women. My grandmother, like I said, I may agree, disagree with her, but she was definitely a strong black woman. My birth mother, who had to make really hard decisions, right? I got to see her. My sister, who was older than me, who had a child when she was 16 and then joined the army shortly
Mm,
there following, another person who's a black woman, who's a strong black woman. So I had these
sure.
women around me growing up, and I saw that, and I respected all of these women in different ways. And then even in my adoptive household, black women were always spoken of positively within my adoptive household too. And so I always felt more drawn to black women than I did to white girls or white women, but I know that that is not an experience for a lot of us interracial adoptees out there.
So now, at this point in your life, do you have a relationship with your birth mom?
I do not. I do not have a relationship with my birth mom, and the last time I spoke to her was about 10 years ago. So my sister had actually found her information online and had just cold called my birth mom. She calls my birth mom and had a conversation with her. And after the conversation, she calls me and she says, Tony, you won't believe it. I just spoke to our mom and she wants to see us. She wants to have contact with us. And we hadn't spoken to her in 10, 15 years before that. And so I said, okay, great. That's awesome. And my sister said, she really wants to talk to you. You should give her a call. So I gave her a call.
Hmm.
She asks me, hey, Tony, how are you doing? How's your life going? Then she says, I'm so sorry I wasn't able to raise you. Or actually, I have two sisters. I found out through one sister's through Cole's adoption. I found out later. I'm so sorry I couldn't raise your sisters and you. And then she says that, I'm very proud of you. And I said, thanks. Angie said that she would like to hang out or all of us to hang out. And I would love that too. Is that something you would want? My mom says, yes, it is something I definitely want. And I said, okay, great. Are you still living in the area that you're living? Maybe we could meet up there, meet up at a park somewhere. And she said, great. And I said, okay, great. So, you know, yeah, that sounds really nice. We could meet up somewhere and that would be awesome. And then after that, I just remember following up and asking kind of the same question, or just following up in general, perhaps. And the phone went dead. And so I didn't know what happened. So I called back and then it rang once and then it went to voicemail. And then I called back again and then it went straight to voicemail.
Mm,
And I just left a message and I said, hey, mom, I know that you might not be ready to see us right now. And that's okay. We forgive you and we're not mad at you. She thought both my sister and I were just very mad at her, and we would love to see you whenever you're ready. And so that was the last time that I had contact with her.
mm,
Again, my mom is schizophrenic, so I don't know where she is from a mental standpoint either, but I know that there's still love that she has for us, and of course, love that we have for her too. And these birth family relationships are always complex and complicated for
sure,
reasons like this.
sure. And at this point, tell me about your adoptive parents or your parents, I should say.
Right. I mean, it's both correct. Right. So my one of my adoptive parents, Mary, died when I was 12 years old, and she died of cancer after a 4 or 5 year battle with it. And my mother, Janet, my adopted mother, Janet, and I were the people remaining in the house after that. And so Janet is doing well. I saw her yesterday, and it was my birthday yesterday, so I saw my mom yesterday. And she she's someone that I have had a better relationship with as the years have progressed. We
Okay.
butted heads a lot when I was a teenager, and our relationship got a lot better when I went off to college. But I would say that she's always someone I use as an example in my trainings of great things to do as an adoptive parent and some ways that you can do better as an adoptive parent too, right? So it's the both and that exists there. And I think that's been very relevant for our relationship. But I am glad about where it stands today.
Now, is she very instrumental in helping you because you do a lot of talks and discussions? And has she ever participated with you in any of them?
You know, and my friend Isaac Eder, he's someone that does a really great job trainings with his mom, with his adoptive mom.
Yes,
And so shout out to Isaac.
sure.
My mom and I do not do trainings together. My mom is extremely introverted in a lot of ways, but she does attend all of the trainings that I do that she can basically.
Okay.
She'll text me and she'll say, "Hey, I'm about to attend this training or that training," and I'll say, "Cool, great." And so she hears what I say, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and I'm glad that she's able to receive it, and I'm also glad that I can still deliver the messages that I want to deliver, even if she's listening.
Sure.
I think it points to where I am and where we are also in our relationship.
So, my final question to you, if you had anything to say to an adoptee, what would you say?
Say, take care of yourself. Take care of yourself. Continue to get to know yourself. Continue to be around people who make you feel like it's okay to continue to get to know yourself. Take heed to separate yourself from individuals who are not supporting you, who are not supporting different pieces of your identity, even if those people are your adoptive family, sometimes if they're your birth family. Feel free to not engage in relationships that are not pouring back into you.
Mm,
I heard earlier today an adoptee say, she said, I do this work because I'm an adoptee. She's a professional in the space. She said, I do this work because I'm an adoptee. And she said, and because I got out. I was in a third world country and I got out. I want us to think as adoptees about what getting out to us means in practice. Because for this person, it meant leaving their home environment, previous home environment. And I'm not someone to tell an adoptee how to feel. I think a lot of times the messages that we are putting out there as adoptees are internalized messages that we think we need to feel because society has told us that previous places are bad places, that the new places are automatically good places. And that's too black and white, a picture to paint when it comes to life in general. Nothing is black and white. And the places that we came from had love somewhere in them, even in the most dark of circumstances. So sometimes people say to me, Tony, what about the birth families that abused their children? And that's the reason why they went into foster care in the first place. And so I say, well, just because the birth families abuse these children, it doesn't mean that those children can't have love if they would like to for their birth families. I interacted with someone who's a friend of mine, and he went into the foster care system when his birth sibling was killed by his birth mom when he was around 12 years old. And he's in his 30s now, and he was telling me that when he was in his 20s, he started visiting his birth mom in prison. and that relationship that he has with his birth mom is something that has been very helpful to him in a generalized standpoint. And so I say that to say that it doesn't mean that all adoptees that we need to feel the way that he felt or react the way that he reacted in a long-term way, but it does again remind us of the power of those relationships that we have with members of our birth families, even in relationships where terrible things happen. And it doesn't mean that it means that we don't have to hold feelings of needing to separate or needing to be angry, but it means that it's also okay at the same time for us to hold anger, right? It's okay for us to hold all of these feelings that we have for our birth families, for our adopted families, about our racialized identities, the why me's of it all, while also continuing to get support from our peers, from, if you want to, from your adoptive community, because we're always there for you. And we're always here to help each other continue to grow.
And on that note, I want to thank you so much for coming and sharing your story and providing such amazing insight. That was definitely a mic drop moment because I can't follow that. All I can do is just end the show. That's it. So hang on, don't leave me. Give me 1 second. And on that note, bye, family.
Yeah. Thanks, Tarcia.
Journey on. You need a pie with the good? Oh yeah, what is the one?